and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I'm very excited. I am legitimately excited about today's guest. I've actually been reading his book because I've been waiting for a very long time for it. And I think it's a really important book that dovetails with a lot of the things we've been talking to people on here about for a very long time. And I'm talking about none other than my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Ruy Teixeira. He's a political demographer and commentator and a senior fellow at AI. He co-edits the weblog and the Substack newsletter, The Liberal Patriot, which is great. And I highly recommend people subscribe to it after they subscribe to the Dispatch. And he has got a new book with his co-author, John Judas, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes. Ruy, welcome back to the Remnant.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jonah. Delighted to be on and talking about the book and all that jazz.
So first rule of book authors on this podcast is I always ask them, what's your book about? So what's your book about?
Well, our book, Jonah, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? Is about basically the evolution of the Democratic Party, primarily in the 21st century, though we do take the story back to the late part of the 20th century as well. And in a sense, it's sort of a sequel to the book John Judas and I put out in 2002, The Emerging Democratic Majority, where we looked at some of the ways in which, as it were, the tectonic plates of American politics were shifting in terms of demographics, economics, ideology, what have you. And we thought that this was creating a sort of a good playing field for the Democrats, which would allow them to perhaps forge a majority that could be dominant for some time. Now, in the 21st century, that didn't come to pass. The 2008 Obama election was an indicator that maybe we were right, but it quickly fell apart. And so we're trying to understand in the book, why did the Democrats, in a sense, blow their opportunity? What was that about? And how did we arrive at a situation where we're basically at an electoral and political stalemate between the parties, where the Democrats, despite the manifest weaknesses of their opponents, really can't get much off the 50-yard line of American politics? Why are we in this frustrating equilibrium? And so we try to trace that story going back to, again, the late part of the 20th century with the Great Divide that opens up between the working class and the college educated, between small town and rural and exurban America and the thriving post-industrial metropolitan areas, the sort of flyover country versus the coasts, that the Democrats become identified with the approach to economics that was basically a lot of these people thought was antithetical to their welfare. And in fact, they weren't doing very well and they didn't feel the Democrats particularly cared about them. Issues around trade, issues around what happened with the banks and financial deregulation, which a lot of which comes home to roost in the early 2000s. And a lot of these voters just bailed out on the Democrats. They just said, hey, these aren't our people anymore. And in the 21st century, this is very truncated.
No, I know, but it's a good foundation.
In the 21st century, we see this underscored and really accentuated by the Democrats' ongoing embrace of cultural radicalism on race, gender, immigration, crime, climate. We actually include as a cultural issue at this point, and of course the gender wars and so on. So a lot of stuff that was on the campuses spilled out and took over, in a sense, the Democratic Party as a whole, particularly its penumbra of the shadow party, the foundations, activist groups, nonprofits, the infrastructure of the Democratic Party itself, good chunks of the media that lean center left. They all started singing from the same hymn book about a lot of these issues. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at the data and you look at political behavior, it's clear that these positions are not in the wheelhouse of your median working class voter, particularly white working class voter. And we saw that was what delivered Trump's victory in 2016. And now increasingly we see non-white, especially Hispanic working class voters bailing out from the Democrats because they've both lost faith in them in terms of being able to deliver the economic life they want. And they feel like the sort of the commitments they have on a cultural, social level are not their commitments. The Democrats care about a lot of stuff I don't care about or I flat out disapprove of. So why am I still signed up with these guys? So it gives the Republicans a way of sort of starting to dig into that non-white working class base of the Democrats. But as we've seen, not enough yet to tilt the balance decisively in their favor, even though, I mean, broad brush, you could argue at this point, the Republicans are the party of the working class in America, just by pure nose counting. They have more of those voters, whereas the historic party of the working class, the Democrats, does not, and is increasingly dependent on college-educated voters, particularly liberal college-educated voters. So that's in a nutshell kind of what we're trying to talk about and analyze in the book. How did we get to this point? What does it all mean? Is there a way out for the Democrats? And that's obviously a very difficult question, but we at least want to pose the question, the problem that Democrats have to face, which should start as solving all problems does, but just understanding the friggin' problem.
So I want to go back to the emerging Democratic majority just for a second. I think you and John Judas got a bit of a bad rap and then increasingly worse rap as time went on about the book, because the book was much more nuanced and had caveats. It always seemed to me that part of the and I was critical of the thesis as interpreted by a lot of Democrats at the time. I went back and looked at things I wrote back in the day. But it seems to me that it's sort of like making a wish with a monkey's paw. One of the reasons why the Democrats got themselves into trouble was believing the cartoonish version of your thesis. It's sort of like, if I know I'm going to win next week's Powerball, I'm going to behave in ways that, let's just say, deviate from well-established norms of bourgeois behavior.
From welfare optimizing behavior.
And if you think it's demography is destiny, it's all in the cards. It's rigged, not in some sort of Trumpian rigged sense, but like by providence, just like these people are always going to be our voters, so that we don't have to worry about persuading the voter at the margin who maybe doesn't agree with us on anything. That almost guaranteed, that was sort of the curse of the thesis, which was that it made its undoing more likely precisely because people believed that it was true. Do you think that's fair to some extent?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. Going back to the book, our argument was, as you say, much more complex and nuanced than it was typically understood to be. We looked at a number of changes taking place in the country, particularly the rise of the non-white population, but also the rising population of professionals, which was increasingly aligning toward the Democrats. We looked at changes in the voting behavior and preferences of a lot of women voters, particularly single, working, and educated women. We looked at what we called the Ideopolises, which were these thriving post-industrial metropolitan areas where clearly they were aligning toward the Democrats, and that's where a lot of the population growth was taking place. All of those things were on the Democrats' side. On the other hand, we also had a section of the book where he explicitly talked about the role of the white working class and how critical it was going to continue to be, that Democrats needed to maintain a very substantial share of that vote, 40% nationwide, maybe closer to 45 in a lot of the Rust Belt states where white working class voters are so important, and that they couldn't really sustain this coalition arithmetically and politically unless they did retain that core of white working class support. The political arithmetic just wouldn't work. And that was an extremely important thing for Democrats to take cognizance of and to therefore stick to, in a sense, what would be in the sweet spot for keeping those elements of the coalition together, which we argued was a kind of progressive centrism that did not stray too far from the center of gravity of the American public and of public opinion, but was nevertheless sort of pointing in a direction that was generally progressive on economics and was progressive on cultural issues to the extent that it just took advantage of the fact that America was moving toward much more tolerance, much more distaste for discrimination, much more interest, much more accepting of what you might call the multicultural society. And all that was fine. But, centrism, progressive centrism, we were very clear about that. But all of that gets forgotten pretty fast. I mean, when Obama wins in 2008 with a coalition that looked geographically and demographically like we were talking about, we were hailed as seers, as it were. But of course, it all fell apart extremely fast. 2010, the Democrats get wiped out. And a lot because the white working class really bailed out on them big time all over the country, especially in the Midwest. 2012, Obama comes back, manages to win a second term, in a way, a lot because he was running a sort of populist campaign against the easily characterized plutocrat Mitt Romney, taking advantage of the auto bailout. He actually doesn't win that election unless he brings back a lot of those voters in the upper Midwest. But that's completely misunderstood. Even the Republicans didn't understand it with their famous autopsy after 2012. And certainly Democrats internalized it as, well, okay, this is a coalition of the ascendant, the rising American electorate. They delivered a second term from Barack Obama. It's all clear sailing from here. And that didn't even change in 2014 when the Democrats again get whacked pretty hard by the other side and lose like 9 Senate seats, I think. And that brings us close to and moving into the 2016 election when it all comes home to roost, when the unimaginable happens and Donald Trump is elected president on the backs of white working class voters who shift dramatically in the Republicans' favor, particularly in those key Rust Belt states, but really all over the country. So, yeah, I mean, the Bowdlerized version of our thesis became conventional wisdom in the Democratic Party. Demographics is destiny. If you pushed people a little bit, they'd say, yeah, well, it's not completely true, but mostly true. And I watched it happen with my own 2 eyeballs sitting there at the Center for American Progress. And I desperately kept on trying to point out to people, no, it's not that simple. If you look at the data, we're actually in a lot of potential danger here. And you might want to think about this a little bit more, but it fell on deaf ears.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy. I've told you this before, but I got my start in Washington working for Ben Wattenberg, who was part of the old Coalition for Democratic Majority effort to try to...
The real majority.
Yeah, he led the real majority. He and his co-author, Bill Salmon, coined the phrase, essentially, social issue. And the Dayton housewife and all of that stuff. And he would sometimes struggle with this whole demography is destiny point, but I think he would have said, look, demography can be a really good wind at your back, but you can defy the wind. There are all sorts of ways. We have technology for blocking wind. So I want to talk about the shadow party for a second, because it seems to me that like one of the great frustrations I have, and this is a frustration as much with the Republican Party as with the Democratic Party, is the number of people who think that the right policy is automatically the right politics, right? And I will say this for Rahm Emanuel. Like, Rahm understood that if you're going to run a Democrat in a very red or dark, or near red purplish district, it doesn't make sense to run one who could win in Park Slope, Brooklyn, right? And that, and that the way you actually get good policy.
People's Republic of Brooklyn doesn't play all over the country, is my understanding.
And so, like, this is my frustration right now with all the nonsense in the House on the Republican side, is that so many of these let's call them firebrands for the want of a more descriptive term, they seem to incapable either psychologically, intellectually, politically, or for some other reason, to internalize the idea that actually the way you actually get your preferred policies is by winning more elections and having a bigger majority. And instead, it's always got to be the perfect is better than the good, even though the good is achievable and the perfect isn't. And it feels like that's very much the same dynamic on the Democratic Party. But the people who believe that stuff in the Democratic Party, what you call the shadow party, have much greater power and influence over the Democratic Party. So, like, explain a little bit more about what the shadow party is and how you think it came to be.
Yeah, well, the shadow party, certainly goes back to the late 20th century. And it becomes instantiated to some extent, I think, aided by the decline of the labor movement, which was sort of a working class anchor for the Democratic Party, which kept it oriented in a certain direction. But the Democrats become increasingly dependent and driven by groups and intellectuals and organizations and foundations, what have you, that come out of the movements of the 60s, the women's movement, the environmental movement, the gay movement, a variety of what you might call interest groups that have particular interest in a certain set of issues on which they want to push a certain kind of perspective and a certain kind of policy. And they're not that interested in the economic issues that had typically driven the Democrats, and certainly had little contact with and don't even necessarily care about the average working class voter. So these organizations become increasingly critical to the Democratic coalition in terms of putting it together, in terms of how they govern, in terms of how they set their priorities, in terms of just raw support. They become important just in terms of dollars. And in a sense, they start to outvote and outweigh the traditional anchors of the Democratic Party. And for these organizations, and there's, look, I mean, you look at the center-left media and how it's evolved. You look at the foundations and how they've evolved. You look at the nonprofit groups and how they've evolved. I mean, it used to be the case that nonprofit groups that were oriented on a particular issue were oriented in that particular issue. Now, for most of these organizations, they've just become omnibus liberal organizations that push every single cause that's part of this cluster of things that steer to the heart of the college-educated elites who essentially now control the Democratic Party. So it really changes the face of the Democratic Party, it changes its image, and it changes its priorities. And do these people care about the median voter? Do they even know what the median voter wants? Do they even care about a large majority? Not necessarily at all. And to the extent they do care about it, their typical argument is, and this gets at what you were just saying, Jonah, about the difference between policy that would be good and a policy that's popular or can work politically. They will tell Democrats in no uncertain terms, backed up by meretricious polling, that whatever their policy is that is a good policy, it's also like super popular. You can do this thing. You can advocate for Medicare for all. You can advocate for, immigration reform without any border security. You can advocate for tons of stuff because here's our polling that says so. And there is no contradiction between the policies that we think are great and the policies that will deliver politically. Well, this will mobilize your base and everybody likes it anyway. So, but none of this is true. I mean, this is all pretty deceptive. This is all based on advocacy polling that is really not worth the digital paper it's printed on. But it has tremendous credibility within a lot of Democratic Party circles because this is what people want to believe, that what policy they like is also like super popular and will deliver for them. And this is accentuated by the polarization of the country, of course, where you have tons of representatives and senators who are in relatively safe seats where they can afford to advocate policies that are anathema to people in swing districts, swing states, and to swing voters in general. So that's part of the pickle that they're in. They're working on a bad theory, which is that all the things they're committed to are actually like really popular too and will deliver the majorities they want over the long haul. And that is incorrect.
Yes, I entirely agree with you about the sort of bubble of Democratic elites. And listeners of this podcast know I'm a robust both sidser. So I'm not implying anything's
me too. That goes without saying.
Anything's going great on the right, but like they're asymmetrical phenomenon. What is your? Because it's not just the bubble. It's this thing that you're getting at. It's a monoculture, right? I mean, so it used to be, that the Teamsters were pretty left of center on economics, but culturally kind of a right-wing thing, and they weren't afraid to sort of evince that, or the American, Federation of Labor or whatever, whatever the appropriate union is. And what is your theory of the case for why different, we used to call them in a more benighted period, interest groups, but why different centers of power that are primarily about, like I watch these, for reasons having to do with Original Sin, I watch a lot of Morning Joe in the mornings, and they have these commercials for the ACLU. And it breaks my heart what's happened to the ACLU, because I was a big Matt Hentoff fan, right? I had a lot of this. I'm not a First Amendment absolutist the way those guys used to be, but I always wanted them in the room. I always wanted them making the argument. And now the ACLU is essentially just a we are for progressive stuff organization. And
yeah. And they're a little weak on the civil liberties stuff.
Depending on whatever it is. I mean,
depending on what the issue is.
And so on actual free speech, they kind of suck now. But but they're just sort of a broad blunderbuss. Wherefore, they're sort of the arm of hardcore campus leftists in broader America. And
Right.
what is your theory of the case about why these various institutions or organizations don't have a more zealous sense of fiduciary obligation to stay in their lanes? So, like, is there a reason for it that you can pinpoint? Is it a measurable thing, or is it just a cultural shift that's kind of hard to sort of nail down empirically?
Well, in terms of these orgs, I think a lot of it is, cultural, sociological, cohort stuff. For the people who actually now staff these organizations and have come into it, they do have this broad set of, super progressive commitments, and they do think it's all related. And that is their culture. That's who they talk to. That's who they listen to on social media, which of course plays a huge role in binding all these people together into this one huge progressive blob. That's key, that this is what these people think, that is what they're committed to, and that's what they push. And, there's even like labor market aspects to this, right? Where if you want to move ahead in organization X that's on the left, I mean, you really do need to have all these commitments. You're rewarded for it. It's part of the incentive structure. And another thing is just raw money, Jonah. I mean, you look at the ACLU, they're awash in money. The funding base of a lot of these organizations has changed and grown as they've become sort of omnibus progressive organizations, as opposed to staying in their lane on the environment or on civil liberties or what have you. So it all sort of comes together: money, status, labor market stuff, cohort stuff, and nobody's pushing back is the problem, right? There's not a lot of forces pushing them toward the other side, toward the center. All the forces are pushing them toward these kind of omnibus, pretty severely progressive positions. And there's not a lot pushing them back in the other direction. And then the whole sort of there's sort of whole universe of these kinds of organizations and of the media and of academia, all of whom have changed in the same direction. They're self-reinforcing. They're listing. It's like one massive bubble, right? In a way, the phrase I use for it is the cultural radicals, in a sense, or that part of the left, now controls the commanding heights of cultural production, which is a big advantage for them in terms of getting that message out, but as a debit in terms of actually being able to build a dominant majority and appeal to working class voters, because there's no incentive for them to listen to those kind of voters and even to think about them, because they've got theirs. They've got, the cultural machine is working for them. And, depending on the election, this can work to elect the people who are sympathetic to their causes. And anyway, that's not their priority, building a dominant majority coalition. Their priority is their cultural commitments. And, the sort of being able to bar the door against the fascists on the other side will, of course, take away LGBTQ rights and so on. I mean, fill in the blanks there, but you get the idea.
So I would be remiss if we didn't explore this a little bit, because it is one of the abiding themes of this podcast. And me and our colleague, Chris Starwalt, have been pounding our spoons on our high chairs about weak parties for a very long time now. It seems to me, as I listen to you describe this, right, the missing piece is an actual party. Like, again, I'm not a huge Rahm Emanuel booster, but like for some reason, instantiating.
I heart Rahm.
Yeah, but like manifesting Rahm Emanuel or Mitch McConnell's, understanding that the key to politics is to winning elections, and the key to parties is to winning elections. And if you actually had in sort of the Madisonian vision of how parties, are supposed to work, or the post-era of good feelings sort of lessons, where the whole point of a party is to impose discipline on members of its coalition and say, you're not going to get 100% of what you want, but if you join our coalition, you can get 60% or 70% of what you want, because our interests are aligned that far. And therefore, we're going to ask something of you, Planned Parenthood or ACLU or Teamsters or whoever. We're going to ask you to make some compromises as part of the effort of joining the coalition. And in return, we're going to give you something back tangible that you want. And if you don't have a party playing that role, there is no countervailing force to say to these institutions, these various players, don't ask for 100%, right? I mean, Planned Parenthood asks for 100%. The NRA asks for 100%. And since they have their own donor bases and there's no stick, for the parties to actually say, slow your roll, cool your jets, don't force us into this 100% position that's going to kill us in swing states. Both parties have a maximalist understanding of what they can get from each and every election.
Right. In a way, the stick runs the other direction, doesn't it? I mean, instead of the party wielding the stick, it's the activists out there and the associated organizations and the people on social media who are connected to that world. They're the ones with the stick. So politicians are afraid if they cross them on issue X and don't take the maximalist position, they'll be piled on in social media. They might even get primaried. The media will, cover them unfavorably. There's a lot of things going on which they're afraid of. So it's like instead of the party wielding discipline over, the parts of the party, they're going to force you to take unpopular positions and diminish your majority. And instead, it's those very same people and organizations, in a sense, wield the stick against the actual politicians who have to appeal to the voters, which is a kind of crazy dynamic. And I think, there's this material thing in terms of how they'll be attacked. There's also, I think, just like people don't really understand, a lot of politicians, what voters really want. I think they're somewhat misinformed. I think there's a role for misinformation in that sense. I mean, they're all scared of like losing the base, and all these organizations and activists, they say, if you don't do exactly what you say, the base won't turn out and you'll lose the general. And that's a highly debatable proposition. But I think it is accepted as gospel in many circles. And a lot of politicians, being the risk-averse animals they are, don't want to take the chance.
Right. Also, the biggest threat to incumbency for most of these people is primary. It's not the general election anymore, right? And so the incentive to get reelected is still there. It's just the manifestation of that incentive in the actual mechanisms of politics has bad results now in ways that where it used to drag the parties to the center in general elections, it now pushes them to the extremes in general elections in ways that leave.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, that's a both sides thing for damn sure.
So we're going to move on. We're going to get back to the core part of the book in a second. But if, let's say the Democratic Party brought you in and said, you can assemble a team and you can fix the Democratic Party to be a party that actually wants to be a majority party, what would you do mechanistically? What would you do to the internal operatings of the party itself? And then what would be some of the policies that you say this gets us back to the book. What would be the policies that you think the Democratic Party should prioritize?
Right. Well, I think it's time for our standard disclaimer here that John and I make. This book is not a campaign manual. It's not an advice manual for the Democrats. We're trying to more, or sort of elaborate and delineate the ways in which Democrats are kind of at a stalemate and how they got there. So it's not designed to be a manual picked up by Democratic politicians and then, fix the party.
But very, very quickly, Ben Weinberg didn't want the real majority to be a campaign manual, at least not for Republicans, but Pat Buchanan picked it up and then gave it to Nixon, and they used it to win some elections. So these things can backfire on you too.
You never know. Okay, so, but our general take on when the Democrats have been most successful as a party is when it is the party of the common man and woman, of the ordinary American, the forgotten American, which typically combines a somewhat left of center approach in economics centered on the welfare of the working middle classes and universal uplift with the sort of, moderate social outlook, cultural outlook, maybe even leaning right in some cases. You look at FDR's New Deal and the Blue Eagle, and God Bless America was his 1940 theme song. He promoted Thanksgiving, the lighting the Christmas tree. It was a very patriotic, America, we're all in this together kind of thing. So that's a good orientation for the party to try to promote. I think the ways in which you do it would, I once wrote a piece for the Liberal Patriot called The 3-Point Plan for Fixing the Democrats' Coalition. And the 3 points were: one, move to the center on cultural issues. So a lot of things that, people talk about in terms of crime and immigration, race and gender, there's all kinds of ways in which you can compromise on those things and move in a direction that's more consistent with the median voter and still retain basic progressive commitments. But you have to be clear to voters that that's what you stand for. You do stand for law and order. You do stand for secure borders. You actually, do think that it's maybe not a great idea to medicalize children in an uncontrolled way, and that, in fact, biological sex is real, and in fact, we don't live in a white supremacist society. I mean, you could, in real terms, Democrats could pick which ways we wanted to ostentatiously move to the center. But a Sister Souljah moment on some of these things would not be averse, I think, in the medium term to changing the image of the party. I always thought they blew one with Chesa Boudin when he got kicked out of being the DA of San Francisco for making it 100% clear that's not what Democrats stand for in law and order. We are for law and order. That guy is a whack job, and he doesn't represent what Democrats stand for. But it's a real reluctance to call out any specific name or part of the Democratic Party specifically and make that case, because that's really what will make people sit up and take notice. So regardless of how you do it, move to the center in cultural issues. I argued in that piece the Democrats need an abundance agenda as opposed to just a green agenda or a climate change agenda or whatever. You have to be able to convince people you're going to promote a better life for the ordinary person, which means more stuff, more growth, fast, sort of a country in which it's possible for people to move up rapidly economically. And they don't have the commitment. It's a longer discussion. We have a whole chapter in climate change in the book, but you're not going to convince people that that's your priority if all they hear about in terms of your economic programs is how you're going to fight climate change and save the planet, because this is a low priority in people's parts. And it's not clear what that delivers for them in the short to medium term. In fact, if you look at energy prices, clearly it hasn't helped people much. And people just don't have the commitment to it that Democratic elites do. So that's not an abundance agenda. That's an agenda consistent with the priorities of the people who tend to dominate the party. And the third thing, it gets back to the whole way FDR and those kind of Democrats approach things, embrace patriotism, embrace liberal nationalism. You will never get a big coalition together to change this country in the way that Democrats say they want, or this should really be true on the other side, unless you embrace patriotism, unless, you say we're Americans, we're all in this together. This is a country that has had bad things in its past and good things in its past, and we've used the good to overcome the bad. I mean, this is a common theme of Democrats back in the day, and it's gotten lost because there's such a large proportion of the party who just loses it when they hear people talk about patriotism, about how America is fundamentally a good country as opposed to a country born in slavery, marinated in racism and white supremacists to its core today. This is anathema to positioning your party as a party that can unify all Americans in a common cause. And if you can't unify, really, really broad section of Americans in a common cause to build up the country and renew it, you're not going to get very far. So that's my short pitch for, the kind of way in which Democrats should position themselves broadly. Now, how exactly you would do that in real time with real politicians, that's another question. But I do think that's what they should aim for.
Yeah, I mean, on the sort of liberal nationalism or liberal patriotism thing, it's one of those things that seems so friggin' obvious that it's kind of mind-boggling how difficult it is for some people to grasp. One of my favorite sort of dog whistles or shibboleths that you hear a lot these days in conversations about Donald Trump, whatever, is how a lot of the left and also just sort of mainstream liberals have settled on the phrase "our democracy" instead of one of a dozen other things that are actually less abstract. And there's a weird sort of valence to it that lets people avoid talk about patriotism or American culture or American traditions or values, and instead keeps it sort of abstract and therefore keeps them out of trouble. But you skip the first half of my question, and so imagine you put your poli-sci hat on. Forget the W. So you're not. I totally hear you. I hate when people want me to be a political consultant. It's not my job. But in terms of the actual structure, we have weak parties. I would argue it comes from McCain-Feingold.
Oh, this is the internal mechanics part of your question. Yeah, I did.
Speaking of both parties, let's just say there's a commission, and you're not an unreasonable choice to be on it. Maybe not the chairman, given your position these days, but be on a party, a commission to explore reforming to reforming and restoring the parties, right? And you and Yuval are a block on this commission. What are the actual, like, would you get rid of primaries? Would you reform primaries? Would you do jungle primary stuff? Would you have party conventions? Would you have smoke-filled rooms? What would you do anything to campaign finance, which I'm very torn about because I've always been sympathetic to the conservative arguments about money and free speech, but at the same time, I think the McCain-Feingold and a lot of those campaign finance reforms were a disaster for "quote unquote" our democracy. So, what were things that you think you would do to both parties to sort of get the incentive structure back towards having the threat to incumbency being the general election, and the incentive structure to getting the marginal voter in the center rather than just this incentive structure of tripling down on the base? Or is it not possible to do that given the big sort?
Yeah, well, I think the latter is probably true to some extent. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. But I do think that it would probably be helpful to pursue some structural reforms along the lines you were alluding to. I mean, I don't really have a hard and fast position on exactly what those reforms should be. But I think the general concept, we want to strengthen parties and we want to weaken the influence of activists and money that can sort of be especially influential in low turnout contexts like primary. I mean, this is like a big problem. And Democrats and Republicans would be better off if they had more things pushing them toward the center as opposed to the extremes. So what exactly the most effective reform should be in that respect, I'm not sure, to be honest. I mean, I think the literature on this is kind of a little bit all over the place, but so I don't really feel like I have a secure position on that. But I think the goal would be good, and I would be for most things that would push the parties in that direction. I think another thing that would be helpful, it's not a structural thing, but sort of being very, very clear that what you want to do is reach more working class voters. If you want to do that, how do you do that? And I think that then brings up the issue of the structure of how candidates get nominated and lots of other things as well. But that would put a political impetus behind the desire to change things as opposed to just, let's make our democracy better. Well, that's a good idea, but we're talking politics here. We're talking what would make the Democrats a better party, a more effective party, or the Republicans a better party, a more effective party. And here's what you got to do. And here's the goal. Here's what the target you're trying to aim at. So I think in that sense, structural reform and sort of political strategy can go together. But yeah, in terms of and I don't think, there's clearly not a magic bullet, but even among the bullets available, I'm not sure I have a particular favorite at this point. What about you? Do you want to just abolish primaries?
If I thought that was in the realm, this gets to the sort of like the difference between preferred policy and good politics. Like, it's just very difficult to figure out how you get there to actually get rid of primaries.
Okay, what's your reservation reform, as it were, along these lines?
I'm much more open. I want to see it play out a little bit more, but I'm much more open to these ranked choice systems. I think one of the reasons I got Glenn Youngkin was they decided to do a state party convention, right? I'm very much with Elaine Kmark on this stuff, that we are the only advanced industrialized democracy whose parties have just voluntarily outsourced the ability to pick their own candidates. People say to the voters. No, it's to this tiny slice of the electorate that shows up in primaries.
Right. That's key. Yeah.
You want a deep cut. I'm a E.E. Schatzsnyder fan. And
right. You go.
I'm for democracy between the parties, but not within the parties. The one I toy with a lot, but I'm against for constitutional reasons, is mandatory voting. Because as a thought experiment, it's really interesting. If you actually went the Australian way and forced everyone to vote, the incentive for just boosting the turnout of the base vanishes overnight. Because everyone's voting, so then you go where the majority of voters are, right? And that would be it would be an interesting sort of experiment to do it just once to prove this to people, but that's not going to happen either. I do think that if one party could get its act together, the other party would too. That one of the reasons we have this dysfunction is because with both of them being dysfunctional messes, they don't see the incentive, the competitive pressure to improve their lot. And so it would be great if one party could be a majority party for a little while to prove to the other party, A, it's possible, and B, they need to get their act together because they could be a majority party. But instead, they all think they can just win by galvanizing their base one last time. And then they govern like they have 5 seconds in power, so they better swing for the fences, which guarantees they get thrown out again.
Well, it also promotes kind of millenarian thinking on the part of people in each party. Like we're one election away from wiping out the other side who are just tools of Satan, right? So in a situation like that, your incentive to crank up the rhetoric is high. And also it promotes lazy thinking because you're not really thinking in terms of like, how can I actually like reach persuadable voters in large enough numbers that I can form that dominant majority. It's really a matter of cranking things up and beating the other side, not only again, but maybe this will be the big one, because they are so bad, right? I mean, the other side are so awful that surely people are just about to see how our party is the only party that they should even consider. And that's lazy because it's really encourages you to disregard and not even think about the ways in which tons of voters actually detest your party too. So, I mean, and that's, and now that's why on both sides we have this disincentive to move to the center because they hold sort of mirror image views of the other party.
All right, so let's go back to the stuff in the book about the drivers of this. You guys, which is not surprising, particularly given your co-author is John Judas, have skepticism about the benefits, at least politically, of NAFTA, WTO, and all of that, and liberalizing trade. And you identify a bunch of issues with the problems with immigration. So why don't you sort of walk through those two globalist, issues for the Democrats and what it spelled?
Right. Well, Democrats, they've done the best, right, when they've been viewed as the tribunes of the ordinary man and woman, working class voter writ large. And the effect of a lot of these policies, I mean, if you look at trade, one could argue about what the alternatives were in terms of how globalization evolved in the 80s, 90s, and early 00s. But it certainly was viewed by a lot of these voters as decimating their communities. I mean, the effect of the China shock in particular has been well documented by David Autor et al. In terms of, not only what happened to these communities, but how they moved politically. So there is a deindustrialization left behindness to a lot of these areas that a lot of these voters felt happened on the Democrats' watch. And you could argue there was no alternative. I'm not so sure about that. But nevertheless, that's how it was processed. And certainly, even if it was, for example, one could make the argument, you really had to move in that direction anyway. It's like trying to hold back the tide. Okay, well, what was actually done for these? If you're going to compensate the losers and transform these areas into something different, it sure as hell didn't happen. So that was viewed as a big fail on the part of working class voters. And I think they have a point. I mean, immigration, Democrats used to stand for, an understanding that if you have tons of unskilled immigrants coming into the country, that puts pressure on the low-wage labor market, undercuts unionization, and that's not a good thing. The Jordan Commission in the 80s was actually on this, Democratic-oriented, and they had a series of reforms, including, pretty rigorous E-Verify. Well, that wouldn't have been E-Verify at the time, but anyway,
Bernie Sanders was against.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders famously said open borders and the Koch brothers program. Yeah. So it used to be like standard issue Democrats were opposed to openish borders or loose borders and felt immigration, especially the unskilled, needs to be more carefully controlled, and that was an important thing to do for the working class and for unionization. That completely turns around. The Jordan Commission itself and its recommendations were watered down and never implemented. Democrats lost interest in it. Even some of the unions lost interest in it because they wanted to organize these unskilled illegal immigrants. And then in the 2000s, sort of the whole party becomes turned toward mostly being concerned with immigration reform, which is taking the people already in the country and in a sense, legalizing them, and just not worrying too much about the border, and certainly not worrying much about E-Verify. So there's a certain acceptance of high levels of illegal immigration. And also a concomitant, this becomes part of that broad cluster of progressive cultural issues. The only reason anyone would be opposed to a ton of immigration of low-skilled immigrants is because they don't like black and brown people. It's just basically racist and xenophobic. And, America is just part of the world, and people want to come here because they're part of the world too. And, we're a glorious multicultural, multiracial society in evolution. And anyone who stands in the way, obviously they're on the wrong side of history. So, that is a real problem for the Democrats, because as far as a lot of working class people feel, this is part and parcel of the way Democrats have lost track of the interests of working class people. They don't care about competition for jobs. They don't care about taxing the resources of communities that have absorbed these immigrants. They don't care about how it's used to, in a sense, undercut unionization in a lot of areas of the country. They just don't care. So, that's definitely part of our analysis, is that Democrats used to be more careful about how issues like trade and immigration would affect working class voters in their base, and they basically kind of lose interest of it in the last part of the 20th century, and in a sense buy into, what you might call a soft neoliberalism, to use a much abused term, and that that plugs into other things too, like the way the financial sector is dealt with, regulatory issues. Democrats become kind of okay with this financialization of the economy. That's cool. These people are on our side. Silicon Valley, Wall Street. When you're sort of the base that's pushing you in a certain economic direction, it becomes more Silicon Valley and Wall Street and less unions and working class people. That is going to change your party, and by God, it did.
So, how much of it I and listeners will appreciate. I've struggled a lot not to bring up defund the police and Latinx, which are my go-to examples of this problem for the Democratic Party.
I want to defund Latinx. That's my program.
I like it. How much of the issue is, one of the approaches that Obama had, particularly to Obamacare, was this corporatist in the political science sense of getting all the stakeholders from the various interests around the table, right? And that they were just going to very, very, not quite syndicalist, but very New Deal-ish, right? It was just like, we're going to get the big players around the table and we're going to figure out how to do healthcare kind of thing. And one can talk the merits or demerits of that all one likes, but I think that on the cultural stuff, you see a similar dynamic where you get representatives of these various groups who say, if you want to be inclusive, you need to say Latinx. If you want to be inclusive, you need to talk about birthing persons instead of mothers, right? And this kind of thing. And they might be sincere when they're saying that, but reality, I remember Stephanie Murphy once used this phrase, who I think is sort of the kind of Democrat that you would, think is.
Yeah. I actually talked to her class at the University of Chicago.
Yeah, I think she's great. And she said, look, part of the problem with the Democratic Party is it's so caught up in what she called faculty speak, right? And so like Latinx works in the faculty lounge, but it does not work in a Hispanic neighborhood, block party, because people don't know what the hell you're talking about. And so it's sort of the middleman minority representatives, right? The diversity consultants who are telling the party, the politicians, they're describing a reality that doesn't exist, because it's the reality of the campus, not the reality of the real streets. And I sometimes wonder whether that's a big part of the problem, is that the people who are trying to tell people to how to shape the message are actually trying to shape the message so it's congruent with rewarding for keeping their place at the table.
Yeah, I think the latter is true. The thing about all this inclusivity is actually it's exclusive, because in the sort of alleged move to make things inclusive, using these terms, talking about Latinx, birthing people, what have you, I mean, who does this include? It includes the people who are in on the joke. I mean, the people who speak that talk. For most normie people, most normie voters, especially most working class voters, they have no idea what you're talking about. They think it sounds idiotic. What is it with these Democrats? Not only I'm not sure they're on my side anymore, but they're talking a completely different language. And they probably look down at me for not using that language. So this is a basic disaster in terms of the image of the party. And it's very difficult to shake this stuff loose. Even if the president, back to your example of the fund the police, even if Joe Biden goes up there saying, fund the police, fund the police, fund the police, the fact of the matter is there are tons of people in his party who aren't particularly interested in funding the police and are mostly concerned with a different model of criminal justice reform that seems to be much more oriented toward protecting criminals and actually producing public safety. The idea that Democrats would get out there and say, as Tony Blair immortally did, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, this is not something most Democrats are comfortable doing, but is what most working class voters would be comfortable hearing. So the idea that you should use a certain language or avoid other language because, it would be wouldn't be inclusive or would be like somehow interpreted as being racist, all this stuff takes you away from speaking a language and appearing to share the values of ordinary voters. And that's bad because it doesn't matter, and I know you agree with this, Jonah, how great your policies are that are behind that rhetoric. If the rhetoric they hear and the brand they feel is associated with your party is culturally alien or off-putting to them, they're not going to listen to the rest of it. They're not going to sit down and read the friggin' policy platform on your website. They're interested in whether you're their type of person and their type of party and are generally on their side and don't look down on them. And if they can answer, they can check that off as, yeah, these people, they're on my wavelength, then they'll listen to some of the specifics or those who get through to them. And the Democrats, amazing inability to understand that that's a real thing. The cultural, culture is not just an optional thing that maybe you should think about being more in sync with ordinary voters on. It's not optional. It's a necessity. And if you don't pay attention to that necessity, you are intrinsically putting a ceiling on your potential level of support. And it doesn't matter how great your policies allegedly are.
Yeah, to me, it's sort of like the climate change thing. Like, I think climate change is real, but I don't think it's the existential crisis that it's portrayed as. But even if you think it is, if you propose policies that put millions of people out of work or make gas, double in price, you're actually going to do worse in the fight against climate change because you're going to lose all of these elections and the people who think it's all a hoax are going to get elected. So you need to sort of figure out what is doable in the realm of the possible if you want to fight climate change, right? Or racism or anything,
Yeah, I mean, what people want is, in terms of energy, is cheap, reliable, and abundant energy. And that should be your priority. And there are ways of doing that are more or less consistent with trying to reduce emissions. But that has to be your priority because the actual priority of fighting climate change is like maybe 17 on the list of working class voters' priorities. And they don't think about it in the way that the people who populate the the higher reaches of the Democratic Party do, which is like this existential crisis. What did Joe Biden say recently? The only thing more scary than nuclear war is climate change. Well, Mr. President, I beg to differ. I think nuclear war is a lot more scary. So, the kind of loose, bizarre, unhinged talk that is associated with the climate change issue is really rather remarkable. And I think your point is correct, Jonah. If you actually want to do something about reducing emissions and having a transition to clean energy over the long haul, and let's be clear, it will take a long time. Fossil fuels will be with us for a long time. And everybody knows this. And this is what people want, but Democrats feel obliged to deny it. Remember, Biden famously in his campaign said to the 9-year-old girl, "We are going to end fossil fuels. I promise you that." No, you're not going to end fossil fuels. Wrong. And everybody knows you're bullshitting, So, let's be real about this. Let's pay attention to what voters want. Let's pay attention to what's feasible. And then maybe you'll be able to make some progress. But this sort of maximalist program on climate change and transition to renewables, the idea you can run a industrial economy on renewables is just silly anyway.
It also, I mean, it gets to this point about it being against the political interests of these parties not to sort of talk about certain things. If you listen to the Republican debates, you would think that we just don't drill for oil in this country anymore.
Yeah, actually, Biden's done a good job.
When in reality, we've just broken our record for the most production by far of anybody anywhere. But Biden can't talk about it because his own side will be furious at him for talking about it. So I want to float an idea past you. Let's say we got to take Trump out of the equation, right? Because I get the orange man bad argument for Democrats to stick together to make sure that Trump isn't president. I'm, as you might guess, kind of sympathetic to some of it, and because the orange man is in fact bad. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that it's Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis who's the nominee. Long term, as much as you probably still disagree with a lot of their policies and have congenital sympathies for the Democratic Party in the same way I have them for the Republican Party, wouldn't it be in the long-term interests of this country if the Hispanic vote, or even, which is not going to happen, the black vote, went the way of the Catholic vote and just divided equally? Because all of a sudden, all of the incentives for Republicans to demonize immigrants and for Democrats to assume that they've got them in their pocket and therefore we want as many as possible, all of those dysfunctions kind of go by the wayside because it's a wash. And is that crazy?
No, I don't think that's crazy. I mean, I think the uncontested domination by Democrats of the non-white vote is actually not good for them as a party. So I think, it's going to be a while before the Hispanic vote is split down the middle, but it's already moving in that direction, going from a 2-to-1, constituency to more like 60-40, which is like a big change, and it could go to 58-42. So that is a signal to Democrats that, they're going to have to work harder and in a different way. The black vote, look, if it just goes to 80-20 instead of 90-10, and we're seeing that in polls. We're seeing Trump, and it would probably be true, might be true of another Republican candidate too, getting 20% of the black vote. That's a big difference. I mean, that really reduces the margins dramatically for Democrats. And, that's what they need, is the margins among those voters, because they're not growing as a constituency. Black vote is going to be pretty flat in terms of vote share, whereas Hispanics and Asians are going to continue to go up. So, yeah, I mean, I think if anything could move Democrats away from the lazy bones, demographics is destiny, we don't have to change anything because the other party is so terrible and we're so great. I think attrition in the non-white vote, should push them in that direction. Whether they haven't really received the signals in a big way as yet, I would say, and to some extent that reflects the fact that they're cleaning up among, white college-educated voters in a lot of areas of the country, and that's compensating for these losses. But if it goes on farther, and it becomes ever clearer that Democrats are not nearly as much the default party of non-white voters, I think that is a signal that should be received. And hopefully, as you also say, it would encourage the Republican Party to be more attentive to the way in which their base is changing and what the views of these voters really are. Because even though these voters would be moving to the Republicans because they're dissatisfied with the Democrats, they're not garden variety, super conservative voters who are undifferentiated from sort of the Trumpian base. They're pretty different. So, I mean, the same thing goes for the evolving working class base of the Republican Party writ large. I mean, eventually they do have to figure out how to produce for these voters, and that should move them in perhaps some different directions. And so, maybe they want to de-emphasize some issues, emphasize others, but they have to figure out how to be attentive to that base, or that, the people that are the most loyal voters. I'm not expecting anything to happen soon. I think 2024 is pretty locked in, but I think after 2024, there's at least a chance things will shake up a little bit and the parties will receive and process signals that indicate they need to do things somewhat differently than they have been, because their bases are changing and the political calculus is changing. But, I'm sure as probably true of you, Joan, I'm not holding my breath. Things look pretty pretty unfun for the immediate future.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why my podcast is called The Remnant. um,
There you go.
Just to take a clean bite at it, just last question. Do you think there is anything inherent structural to our again, maybe 2024 is too soon, but by 2028, do you think it is not possible, given the incentive structure and the big sort and all these other things, for one of our parties to be a 60% party, to be a majority party? Or is it just a failure of the imagination, institutional and otherwise, of both parties to think beyond a 51% majority?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a tough barrier to overcome. Because of the way the parties both think, because of the ways the parties are both structured at this point, because of the huge influence of the shadow party in both parties and how slow that's probably going to be to change. Even if the signals are, pretty hard to miss from the 2024 election, however it turns out, I think there's a lot of things will get in the way of processing that in a way that might move either of the parties toward that more aggressively majoritarian approach. John Judas, my co-author, his typical rap on this is it'll take some sort of crisis that we can't yet anticipate. But it would take, in a sense, a shock to the system that's greater than just an election result that would reshuffle the cards, so to speak. But I guess I'm a bit more optimistic. I think it's very hard to predict how political parties and politics in general will evolve. And there's a lot of moving parts here. And I think that the election in and of itself might provide some, enough of a shock. We'll see. And lots of other stuff will happen in the world that'll put pressure on the system. And in terms of the economy, we just don't know how it's going to evolve. So in a very broad sense, 2028 is a fair amount of time away. And parties do tend to correct over the medium to long term. They do receive signals and process them. And, they do have an incentive, an overall overarching incentive to maximize votes. You don't have to be a Downsian economic theory of democracy kind of guy to think that there's some reality there. Of course, as we now know, there's a lot of stuff that gets in the way, and parties are not perfectly rational, but they're not perfectly irrational either. So I maintain a margin of hope about the rest of the 2020s.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is partly because the elections are always so close that you never have you never smacked in the face with the lesson that.
Yeah, it's not like Reagan 84. So yeah, unlikely to see that.
All right. Ruy Teixeira, on that cheery note, thank you so much for doing this. And I hope you'll come back. And I really do highly recommend to everybody the book, which is Where Have All the Democrats Gone? And I will talk about it more in my closing remarks in a second. But thanks for doing this.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jonah. This was great. It's always good conversing with you, and happy to come back at any time.
Okay, so Ruy Teixeira has left the studio. It was great having him along. I do recommend the book. I mean, if you think that all my stuff about Democrats being in a bubble and all that kind of thing is me out on a limb, Ruy and John Judas have the receipts on all of that. And again, the book is called Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes. I was talking to him after we stopped recording a little bit. I didn't want to get too deep into it because I was just too prone to rabbit holes. But I do think that, as someone who thinks that we need to support Israel in the Hamas war, and also I also think we need to support Ukraine. But on the Israel front, I think one of the problems is that the shadow party, as he calls it, this informal group of this informal network of influencers and liberal elders and heads of institutions. It's not a conspiracy. It's not the deep state. It's the cultural milieu of one set of democratic elites. I think the shadow party has very similar views on the Hamas stuff, or the Israel-Hamas conflict, or pro-Palestinian position, whatever, its views are a little bit analogous to the Latinx stuff or the defund the police stuff. The confidence with which that slice or a major part of that slice of the Democratic Party thinks that being pro-Israel in this or any other context is a problem is really profound. I mean, it's really deep. It's a sincere belief. I was at the Democratic convention. What was that in 2012, where they booed a pro-God bit of boilerplate in the platform and a pro-Israel thing to the point where I think they pulled the Israel part out. Anyway, I think the thing is that, yeah, look, I mean, there are these somewhat disturbing polling numbers for young people when it comes to Israel. I don't think that the numbers for Biden being, that 70% of young people think he's mishandling the Israel situation. I really don't think, or just the number of people who think he's mishandling it, or the general number of people who think he's mishandling it. I think that's a little misleading because he's unpopular. So whatever the issue you mentioned, they're going to say he's doing that badly too. And I also think there's some small but still significant group of people who think he's handling it badly because he's not helping Israel enough, rather than, it's sort of like the old arguments about Obamacare being unpopular. Well, part of the reason it was unpopular is that a slice of the electorate thought it didn't go far enough towards single payer. And a lot of conservatives would say, oh, look, it's unpopular. They all agree with us. When in fact, close to half or near half or third or whatever of people who said they didn't like Obamacare said they didn't like it because it wasn't left-wing enough. And I think that there's some of those kinds of dynamics going on. But even so, like, being critical of Israel is one thing, being sort of minimizing or dismissing or sort of even-handed the way a lot of these campus presidents and whatever got themselves caught up in about actual Hamas terrorism is a losing issue. And but the shadow party doesn't see it, doesn't believe it. I think the shadow party, to a certain extent, occupies a lot of the commanding heights of a lot of these of a lot of media outlets, and so they're desperately to make this a sort of and on the one hand, on the other hand, both sides evenly divided kind of thing about support for Israel, about condemnation of Hamas, about condemnation of pro-Palestinian terrorism, and it's not one of these split down the middle kinds of issues. It's just that there are the constituencies of the left-wing base that are determined to make it sound like that, and there are a lot of pliant media outlets that are willing to echo that. And so, like, you could see it in some of the coverage of the pro-Israel rally in Washington, where on the one hand, here are, nearly 300,000 people supporting Israel. On the other hand, here's like 6 guys named Shlomo who are anti-Zionist Jews. See, it's a split. But I think Biden and Blinken and those guys deserve some credit because they really are fighting a big swath of their own party who see this as one of these issues like defund the police or whatever, or Black Lives Matter, that the authentic voice of the masses is on their side when it's not actually. But anyway, we can talk about that more. I'm actually going to have Brother Steyerwalt on the next episode, so maybe I'll talk to him about that. And I do want to remind folks that we have that we're doing these Ask Me Anythings or AMAs, that they're up in the skiff. We did the first one, got some positive reviews, got some negative reviews. I agree with some of the negative reviews. I agree with some of the positive reviews. But the best way to get more positive reviews and to make it a more enjoyable experience is, first of all, to experience it, which requires subscribing to the Dispatch. And then second of all, to send more pointed, fascinating questions to the Remnant at thedispatch.com. That's the Remnant at thedispatch.com. And other than that, thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.